Tomorrow is Vav Chukas. Vav Chukas means Erev Shabbos, Parshas Chukas, not Vav like obviously. Vav Chukas. It's the only tainus on the Jewish calendar that is connected to a day of the week, like a Kefi the Sedra, a day of the week, and not connected to a particular date on the Jewish calendar, which is a unique anomaly. Now, the Magen Avram in Siman Taf Kuf Pei in Orach Chaim, when the Magen Avram discusses all the various tanesim on the books, so the Magen Avram says like this. He says, he brings Isa B'Sefer Atanya. Now, sorry to disappoint. Yeah, Isa B'Sefer Atanya. No. It says, in Sefer Atanya, it says, B'yom HaShishi Parshas Chukas, Nagu Hayechidim Le'Sanos, Sheba'oseh Hayoim, which happened to have been Tes Tammuz, which I think was yesterday, so it's actually very good timing this year. Nisrfu Estrim Kronos Maleim Svarim, 20 wagons full of Svarim were burnt with Sarfas in Paris. They weren't kaveyet b'mei chodesh for Tes Tammuz. Because of a she'elas chaloim, they became aware of the fact that the kviyas of this, or the cause of this mu'urah that happened to Klal Yisrael, had to do with the day of the week, the day of the Sedra, not the day of the month, and therefore they were kaveyet that way. Now the dream that he's referring to in the Sefer Tanya is that they had a dream b'she'elas chaloim. It's not clear who the one who did this is, but they sent the she'elas chaloim. And in the Chalaim, and there's the famous part, the dream came back, it's a Dag Zeres Teiraisa, which is the Targum on the Pasuk of Zeres Chuk Satira, and mainly they understood that this is a tainus that had to do with, the Kvi of the tainus had to do with the day of the week. Now, I want to discuss the Mu'urah that he's talking about, what the Tanya is talking about, what the Magen Avram is bringing down. There are still Kreis in Klal Yisrael that do some sort of adherence to this minig. By and large, it's one of the lost Tanesim. We could write a whole book about those. It's one of the lost Tanesim, but there is some shirayim of this that's left. And I want to talk about what happened on that day, the story of it, and I have a shtickle mahalach in it that I wanted to go through a little bit like this. So just let's get the story out of the way. Today, actually, most of the days are just stories. But today, so the story is as follows. In the year 1240, there was a Meshomid by the name of Nicholas Danan. Now, not much is known about him, Grada, from his previous life as a Jew. If he was a Talmud Chacham, if he was an Am Haaretz, if he got into a fight with his Rav, if he got kicked out of shul, how exactly he became such a, like a virulent anti-Talmudist is not clear how and why that transpired. We don't know a lot about him from beforehand. But Nicholas Danan, obviously was Epis of Darga V'Yedei Sefer. He was able to learn a little bit. And he had various segments of the Shas translated into, I believe, Latin, and sent to Pope Gregory IX, who up until that time, and a lot of this is very well documented because the Catholics kept good documentation of this. So he sent large segments of the Talmud that was translated into Latin to Gregory IX, and Gregory looked at it and said, first of all, he was surprised to know that the Jews are relying on other books besides the Bible. It just shows you the amaratzis of the Pope. The Pope in 1240 said he had no idea that the Jews were relying on other books besides the Bible. That's a chiddush to him. And adasin lahachi that they're relying on other books. Let's take a look at this book, and this book is full of blasphemy and cruelty and illogical things and all sorts of terrible things, and it needs to be dealt with. This was the Pope. Now, what's interesting is not that this excuses the Pope in any way, but what's interesting is that the Church had been coming off several schisms amongst Catholicism. Catholicism wasn't always so peachy, what I'm saying? They were coming off several schisms, and the Pope, who was trying to reassert control of the Catholic Church and figure out exactly what the dogma of the Church was and what the Church believes and what the Church holds about every topic, was in a very strict mode, and he turned his attention to the Talmud. Now, he directed, in order for this to have like the imprimatur of royalty and not just a religious war, he reached out to the King of Paris, who I think was Louis IX, incidentally, to Gregory IX, Louis IX, and Louis IX and Louis's wife, who was also, royalty, and the Dowager mother-in-law, the Rebbitzin, Louis's mother-in-law, was also, he reached out to her. These obviously must have been like a royal, I don't know much about Louis's mother-in-law, but they were obviously, important royalty in Europe. And he had all these people get together, and they set a date to have a debate about the Talmud. Now, this is the dispute of the Talmud in 1240 in Paris. The bishop of Paris a lot of this is like actually very, very documented. It's the bishop was William of Paris. The inquisitor, meaning like the main prosecutor they brought on, was Henry of Cologne. It's a German prosecutor. They outsourced a beautiful team of very talented, polemicists who could argue with the Talmud, and headed by Nicholas Danan himself, the Meshomid, who brought the translations of the Talmud, and he was going to lead the discussion. There was more. There's a whole bunch of them. Now, the Jews also had a chance to form a pretty solid team, a pretty heavy team to debate back, headed by Vichil Pariz, who's one of the Balei Taisvis. He's actually, in a certain sense, one of the last Balei Taisvis, because once the outcome of this trial was decided and the Shas was burnt, the world of the Balei Taisvis came to a crashing end. This is really the culmination of the Balei Taisvis. After that, there is the Merami Rottenberg. You could call him a Baal Taisvis in a certain sense, but he's not a Baal Taisvis. And his Talmidim, the Taisvei Harash, is Me'ein Taisvis, but again, they're not really Balei Taisvis. It really makes a big change, a big mark on the scene. So Vichil Pariz is one of the last Balei Taisvis. The Sar Mikutzi, I can't pronounce the French, maybe Barish could, but the Rav Moshe of however you would pronounce it, Kutzi, we'll just go with Kutzi, but Rav Yehuda of Melun and Rav Shmuel of another French town that I'm not going to try to pronounce, were all brought in as the team, Kilu, to debate with Nicholas Donin and his team. Now, obviously, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. The Pope, in his edict ordering the debate, three or 4 years before the debate was actually scheduled, already said that should the Talmud be found to be as monstrous as I perceive it to be, it should need to be destroyed. So meaning that's all nice and hypotheticals, but he really paskined already what had to happen. He just wanted it to go through the technical legal system of the French monarchy and then just sort it out. Now, in any case, the trial is recorded in a few different places. Now, there is a Hebrew version in the Eitzer Avikuchim from Rabbi J.D. Eisenstein, which is a very interesting sefer. So he collects all the vikuchim that Klal Yisrael had throughout the Deiros. So the vikuach of Rabbi Chilmi Pariz in 1242 or 1240 or 1244, depending which nitzach you go from, is recorded in there. And it shows Rabbi Chilmi Pariz. It does have the bones of Rabbi Chilmi Pariz disputes and his terutzim, etc. But it was actually recorded in much greater detail by the church in Latin, and now it's available in English. There's a book, the Trial of the Talmud. It's a book that's available in English with the exact, in mamish, in great detail, what the discussion was. And Nicholas Donin, Yamach Shemoy, made a great case. If I was a Catholic, I probably would agree with him. Meaning he made a great case that the Talmud has things that are opposed to Catholicism, that are opposed to Yeshu, that are opposed to various tenets of the church. And try as he may, Rabbi Chilmi Pariz, and a lot of the things that he says are creative and brilliant things that Rabbi Chilmi Pariz to try to deflect the arguments of Nicholas Donin. He is not able to deflect the ultimate underlying thing. Rabbi Chilmi Pariz actually is of the opinion that the Gemara never refers to Yeshu B'chlal in the Gemara. Even though Yeshu is referred to in the Gemara several times, Chilmi Pariz, through getting the dating and showing who it's meridic, it's amazing stuff, but it wasn't enough to turn the tide. And it was nigzer on the Shas to be burnt in Paris. It was the year probably 1242 or 1244, and there's different discussions. It was 20 wagons full or who?
The Gemara should be pro.
No, but if it's not an open-minded time. It's not an open-minded time. There's not allowed to be another. It's not that yet. Now they took 20 or 24 wagonfuls of all the svarim they could find. Officially, it was Xer on the Shas, but it wasn't only on the Shas. It was Xer on everything. They took everything they could find, primarily Shasin. Now, you have to keep in mind, let alone Eitzar Chachma didn't exist, printing didn't exist, right? So Shasin were handwritten to have not fagreis the Shas, like a Shas that was a good Madura with good, Ksavim, that had some of the Kontresim. Rashi wasn't on the Amid yet even, probably at that point. The Kontresim of Rashi and the Kontresim of the Balei Taisvis and the various different Kontresim of Balei Taisvis that were floating around, meaning to have a proper Shas with all the things that we can take for granted now that are on the daf and the daf of Shas, was first of all expensive and rare, and you have to imagine a wagon full, 24, I don't know, with several tons of Gemaras that were burnt in Paris in that day. That was enough to put an end to the yeshivas of the Balei Taisvis, meaning the Balei Taisvis' reign in France was put to an end by this, and over time they migrated to other places, and it just dissipated. Now, of course, there were still people who knew Kol Terakula, and the Messiah didn't end abruptly because the Shas was gone, but it made a tremendous rupture in the Messiah of the Balei Taisvis when the Shas was destroyed. It's a tremendous amount of Gemaras and Svarim that were burnt at that time. Now, there's one Nakuda that always struck me very interesting from that thing. There was a young man, a young Talmud Chacham who was in Paris at the time. He was probably a Talmud of Rabbi Chilmi Pariz, that seems to be. He was learning in the yeshiva of Rabbi Chilmi Pariz, who was one of the flagship yeshivas of the Balei Taisvis. He later goes on to be a very famous and tragic person on his own. He's the Meir Rottenberg, the Rami Rottenberg. Now, the Rami Rottenberg was a young man. He was probably in his 20s when this happened. Now, he witnessed the burning of the Shas in Paris at the time, and he composed a kinna that we still say in Tisha B'Av today, that we still say every year. A kinna, I mean, if you say all the kinnas, even if you don't, even if you're in a place that skips kinnas, this is usually one that makes it onto the list. Shali Srufa Be'esh of the Rami Rotenberg, that was written after he witnessed the burning of the Shas in Paris, is one of the basic ones. Now, there's an angle in that kinna that I want to focus on that I think is relevant to understanding like a certain Havana in the tragedy of the Sreifas Talmud. Now, first of all, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the Ashkenazim are not famed for their prose. Most of the beautiful kinnis and it's not. I mean, Ashkenazim actually piyut. Ashkenazim are very good at and are very marachin and like Chaim Ozer spoke about several weeks ago. But piyut is different. But in kinnis, meaning a lot of the kinnis are and the Rami Rotenberg is not famed to be a famous poet. That wasn't like his claim to fame. The Rami Rotenberg. He's the composer of maybe several hundred, maybe several thousand chuvas that he's famous for, in various different maduras that were published later on, but he's not famous for being a kinna writer. And this kinna that the Rami Rotenberg wrote is actually based on an earlier kinna that Yehuda Halevi wrote of Tzion Halei Teshali. Now, Tzion Halei Teshali is a kinna that we also say. It's also one of the primary kinnas that's still in the kinnas that we say every year. But Tzion Halei Teshali L'Shlem HaSirayach, which is meaning the kinna, the paitan, Yehuda Halevi is manning Tzion to inquire about the well-being of your children who are dispersed and are broken through Akalas. Now, and I'm not a big expert in piyut or kinna or anything like this, but those who are say that the format of Tzion Halei Teshali and Shali Srufa Be'esh match each other. They have the same amount of lines, the same amount of words, the rhyme structure is similar, the syllable structure, like the words, the amount of syllables used in each word. Now, this is above my pay grade, but this is how it is. Now, which means the Rami Rotenberg took a concept that the Rabbi Yehuda Halevi expressed about Churban Yerushalayim, which means the Churban of Klal Yisrael, the separation of Klal Yisrael from Yerushalayim, and he applied it to the separation of Klal Yisrael from the Torah. Meaning he replaced Tzion in the Beis HaMikdash with the Torah, and Klal Yisrael's bond with the Torah and the way that it was challenged and harmed by the Sreifas Talmud rises, in his opinion, to the level of Klal Yisrael's bond with Tzion, with the Beis HaMikdash, and the way Klal Yisrael was challenged and dispersed and sent into Galus after that happened. Meaning it's a very interesting, it's a little bit of a chiddush comparison. Meaning, of course, everyone understands that Sreifas HaTorah is a big deal, but Sreifas HaTorah is the same as Churban. That's the chiddush that Rambam brings, and he bases it very much on a piyut, an earlier piyut from Yehuda Halevi, and he does like similar things. Now, I want to stam the piyut is the kinna is a is an interesting kinna. There's a few similar lines actually that he uses. For example, when he talks about cries going all the way to Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron on Har HaHar, that's an exact similarity that he borrows from Tzion Halei Teshali. There's a few different parts, but so it's. With church burning.
The church where it was burnt in front of.
Yeah. Oh, the Notre Dame. Yeah. No. No. Well, what he say?
They wrote that it was in the same place.
I don't.
It was in front of the church, but the grammar it doesn't refer to it. There's a line that twisted that copy.
But so I'm not sure. I just want to show you something interesting. So now, there's another component of the Shali Srufa Be'esh. Aside from the fact that he compares it to Churban Habayis, there's another kudah. The Rami Rotenberg is addressing clearly the competition between Catholicism and Yiddishkeit. He's addressing, which was the underlying tension of this all over here, is that the Catholic Church saw the existence of Jews and a Torah as very challenging to their worldview. L'mashal, I'll read you something that he says over here in the middle. He says, which is literally like a borrowed line from Yehuda Halevi. The Eshel, and I'll ask Moshe and Aaron, is there a new Torah, and that's why the Glilei Sefer Torah were burnt? Meaning it's a direct challenge to the Messiah of Torah that's being discussed over here. And he continues, Chodesh Shlishi v'Huksha Haravi, the Chodesh Shlishi, which is the month that Torah was given, now became connected to the Chodesh Haravi, which is Tammuz, when the Torah was destroyed. It's a beautiful and very poignant kinna that's based on a kinna from the Churban. Now, this Nakuda that the Rami Rotenberg seems to hold, that the Churban of Klal Yisrael's distancing from the Torah, losing wagons full of Gemara, rises to the same level as the Churban of Beis HaMikdash, and that there's a tushel over there. That's the Nakuda that I wanted to explore a little bit. And I want to come at it from a shtickle different angle. There's Psukim and Daniel. Now, Kriya is not my strong point. And Kriya of Daniel is certainly not my strong point, but Daniel's in Arab. It's a whole different language. But in Parak Zion, Daniel is a we spoke a few weeks ago. Actually, we mentioned Daniel. So Daniel is a fascinating sefer. Now in Parak Zion, which is the first Chazayin of Daniel, the first Nevuah of Daniel, it says as follows: B'shnas Chadl Belshazzar, in the first year of Belshazzar's kingdom, Melech Bavel, Daniel Cholam Chaza, B'chazi Reisha Al Meshkave Be'edin Chalma Kasav Rosh and Milan Amar. So Daniel had this wild vision, this wild dream at night, and when he awoke, he wrote down the Rashi Prakim so that he could preserve this Chalaim. Now here's what he says. He says, Ana Daniel Va'amar. Chazeh havis b'chazoi im leila v'aru arba ruchi shmaya megichan liyam rabbi. I saw a large body of water. V'arba chavin ravrivin salkun minyama shanyin daminda. 4 big creatures, extraordinary creatures, came out of the water, and each one of them looked different than each other. Then he continues on. He says, Kadmaisa was ka'aryeh. The first one that came out looked like a lion. V'gapin dinashallah, it had the wings of an eagle. Then he continues on, and the next one he says is ve'aru cheva achroi tanina damel doiv. Then the next one came out, it looked like a bear, he says, and it had 3 ribs, like big ribs of meat. Ilim b'pumaya ben shinaya, held in its mouth between its teeth. And then he says the next one came out, and it looked like a kinamer. V'lo gapin arba dioif al gabei. It had 4 wings. V'arba roshan l'chivusa v'shaltim yasvei. Then he says, so he's breaking it down. There are these mysterious creatures that are coming out of the water. Obviously, they're metaphors for something, which we'll see in all the Rishonim talk about. Everyone talks about, but 3 come out, and then the 4th one he says is as follows. The 4th one he says, "Riviyasa dechila ve'imsana v'tkifi yisera v'shnindi." The 4th one came out, he says, and it was bigger and stronger and more ferocious and more frightful than all the other ones that came before it. V'shinayan di parzalala ravrivin achlo madka v'shara rafs, and it had these large iron teeth that it was just eating and crumbling and consuming everything that came in front of it. And it was different, it looked different and more frightful than all the other animals, and it had 10 horns. I was observing its horns. And one little Karen seemed to be growing up, like an 11th Karen, growing up amongst the 10. And then it supplanted all the rest of them, and it took over them. Now, what's the Nir referring to? So there's a lot of raid in the Rishonim and the Mashal. What's interesting is that clear. So let's say what's clear, and then we'll talk about what's not clear. What's clear in the Psukim of Daniel is that Daniel is referring to the Dalet Goliath, and that Klal Yisrael is going to endure. He's referring to the Dalet Goliath, and Chazal in various places say that the first one, when he says he saw a creature that looked like a lion, that's Allah Ari Misvachai, like the pasuk says, Nebuchadnezzar is considered an Ari, Allah Ari Misvachai, and the fact that it had wings like a Nesher refers to a Nevuah from I think Yirmiyah refers to it as a Nesher, the Nevi'im refer to it as different things. So it's the Malchus of Nebuchadnezzar, it's the Babylonian Empire that's coming to conquer Klal Yisrael. Then it continues on, it goes to a Doiv. Now Chazal tell us that Ilu Parsiim, Daimim L'Doiv, Mesurbalim B'Basar K'Doiv, they're restless like a Doiv. Paras is considered the Melucha that's most similar to a bear. It's referring to the bear. What are the 3 ribs of meat that it's clutching in its mouth that it's not fully consuming? So there's Machlekes Rishonim, but there are certain provinces that Paras, that the Persian kingdom was never able to fully bring under its control. Maybe Karg Island, no, I don't know. They weren't able to bring it under control, and those are the ribs that are being held in the bear's mouth. Then it switches to a namer. Now a namer is a different type of temperament than a bear and a lion. A namer is like Havi Azka namer. It's very nimble, versatile, challenging. A namer pound for pound is a very thing that refers to the Greeks. When that's Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great burned like a bright star, but it was short. It was nimble. It was in one flash. He swept across the entire Asian plain. He conquered everything. He left over a kingdom that was dispersed between 3 or 4 of his generals. It was like a number. It was just like in a flash. He just conquered everything, and then he was gone. Alexander the Great was dead, in his low 30s. In his low 30s, he caught an infection. He died. That's it. He was brilliant. He was, fine. That's it. Then the 4th one, which is much more frightening than anything else, here's where it diverges into a lot of different Rishonim and discussion as to what's being referred to in the 4th one. Now, there is some shittas that say that it's referring to Islam. The 4th one is Islam. It's a prediction of Islam that's coming. L'maisa, Rav Rishonim don't learn like that. Rav Rishonim don't seem to hold like that. Rav Rishonim hold it's not referring to that. And Rav Rishonim hold that it's talking about the Romans. The Roman Empire that comes up after the Greeks. That's this 4th Galus, this much stronger creature that's crushing and consuming and dominating everything in its path. And there's so many various features of the way the pasuk describes it that are relevant to the description of Rome. And Rome, even though Rome is be'etzem, a continuation of Greek culture, right? It It really started as the Greco-Roman Empire. It starts with Rome, and then it starts with Greece, and then it turns into Rome. And Rome was obviously continuing on the Chachma Yavanis and etc. And even genetically speaking, the Romans and the Greeks share some genetics, but probably the Romans, since they dominated, the Pax Romana was such a more substantial domination of the whole universe and of the Jews, it gets its own mascaras, its own thing. Now, the 10 horns that are being referenced over here is, according to many Rishonim, and the one who I want to really sample from over here, and I think this is the most relevant, is the Abarbanel. Now, let me just back it up here for a second. The Abarbanel is one of the preeminent Mefarshim on Mikra, right, on all of Mikra. Now, the Abarbanel is a famous person. He was a brilliant, what do you call it? But a financial, what's it called? What is it, like a treasurer. The Abarbanel was a brilliant treasurer. He understood financial policy extremely, extremely well. Actually, his father and his grandfather before him were treasurers too. So this was a family thing. The Abarbanel was born in the mid 1400s in Lisbon, in Portugal, to a Spanish family. He was a Sari from Spain, but he was born in Portugal. In his low 30s, he already was hired by the king of Portugal to be the treasurer. He was already his talent was already shining through, and he was brought on board to be a king. Now, he served in Portugal for, I don't remember exactly how many years, 15, 20 years, and then the king who he had been serving died, and there was a succession battle between the two sons of the king, and the son who took over, fearing all sorts of revolts and made a purge, which is somewhat common in court politics. He made a purge, and the Abarbanel saw that his name was on the list, and he made a run for it, and he ran to Spain. Now, he got to Spain in like 1480 something, low 1480s, which was, not a great time to get to Spain. That was, close to the end. He became the treasurer of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, famed for their xera of kicking the Jews out of Spain, like about 8 years before the Spanish Inquisition, before the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. These are all the different stories of the Abarbanel being offered to stay and all the different legends. But the Abarbanel eventually leaves together with his brethren in 1492, and he leaves and he moves on to Italy. I believe he moves to Lombardy, and then from there to Venice. And the Abarbanel, it's interesting, is that if you know the Abarbanel Svarim, you could see when he had free time on his hands. Abarbanel, when he had to work very hard, when he was an active treasurer, very few Svarim are coming out. When he gets fired from a job or he has to go on the run, it's a flurry of Svarim. Like every 2 weeks, the Sefer is coming out. So, it's a fascinating thing. The Abarbanel was a prodigious production machine, meaning it must be that he was working very hard when he had these gigs in the government, because when he doesn't, all of his Svarim come out like in a flurry, like 4 weeks of the Sefer on this, 8 weeks on this, 10, like boom, 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 the Svarim come out. Now, after, it's an interesting thing. The Svarim are dated, like when they came out. He was able to put out Svarim very quickly when he had the time. Now, when the Abarbanel is finally kicked out of Spain with everyone else, and he goes to Italy, and the Jews who were there with him were suffering tremendously, Abarbanel puts out a trilogy of Svarim that are all about the concept of Mashiach. That's what it is. Essentially, the underlying theme that the Abarbanel is discussing is the concepts of Mashiach. Now, they're called Yeshuas Mashiachai, Ma'anei Yeshua, and the third one, Lo Zocher, the second, but it's a trilogy. It's 3 Svarim that he puts out all relating to. Now, Ma'anei Yeshua, the bulk of the Sefer is focusing on Daniel. Daniel is the most expressive Sefer in regards to Sefer Kates, to when Klal Yisrael is going to, have a Geula. Hagam, the Psukim themselves say that we don't really know, and it's not really Niskala, but all the Rishonim, the Ramban and Sefer Geula, the Rambam in the Igeres, the Abarbanel and Ma'anei Yeshua, all make an attempt to anyhow, extrapolate from the Psukim what when the Shas Geula is. Now, the Abarbanel has a wide-ranging discussion of the Dalet Golis that are being expressed in these Psukim. Now, in the Psukim that describe the Golis of Rome, the Abarbanel has a very interesting observation. He says like this. He says, it says there was 10 horns that grew on the thing. He says the 10 horns refer to the 10 Caesars who ruled Rome before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. And he gives a list of the 10 Caesars, 10 important Caesars who ruled Rome before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Then he says, the Pasuk tells us that there's a small horn that grew up amongst the 10 horns and slowly came to dominate all the horns. He says that refers to Catholicism. That refers to the rule of the Pope. He says, as you know, and he's very knowledgeable in the Jewish history, he says, as you know, the church did not originally have much power in Rome. As a matter of fact, they were persecuted. Most of the apostles of Yeshu were killed by Romans, not by Jews. Don't let them tell you otherwise. And they were all killed. Hundreds of years later, in the 300s, Constantine, who was the ruler of Rome, adopted Catholicism as the religion of Rome. He made the Pope into a very important person. And from there, the Pope slowly gained more and more power. So that Abravanel says the gullus, the horn that's being referred to over here, is the Pope slowly rising to power and dominating the entire Roman Empire and making. Now that Abravanel is Meirach on this, and he explains as follows. He says a big portion of Klal Yisrael's gullus, and what makes the gullus of the Romans more fearful, so to speak, and more detrimental to Klal Yisrael than just the other gullusin, is that the Romans are coming for our religion. The Romans, meaning the Pope, the Catholic Church, is coming to say, you're not Jews, your Torah is not Torah, we have the proper Torah Shabbat Peh, we have the right Messiah, yours is wrong, it's done, and now it's our turn, it's our Mahalach. He says, and that's what's being referred to in these psukim, when Daniel describes how frightful and fearful the fourth gullus is, the Roman gullus, the gullus of, that we're still in today. He's describing the gullus, the contest over religion, the contest of the church. Now later on in the end of Perek Zayin, the psukim bring more psukim related to this, and the Rabbanel again reads it into the psukim. Now the Malbim sometimes likes what the Rabbanel does, sometimes he doesn't, but in this regard he's open to the idea that it could be Islam, but ultimately he seems to hold like the Rabbanel primarily, that is referring to this contest. What do you say? No, it's referring to the contest of religion. Now in that context is what do you say? It's referring to something. It's referring to something. The Islam doesn't, it's referring to something. In any case, this is the context, I think, that you need to understand the Sreifas Talmud and what the Merami Rutenberg in his Kinnah is doing. The Merami Rutenberg is addressing the contest that Catholicism sees itself as having with Judaism, and saying Judaism is outdated, Judaism is wrong, Judaism is not the real religion. And the Merami Rutenberg, when he writes the Shali Yisur from Eish, is addressing openly this contest that Catholicism was having with Judaism that led to the Sreifas Talmud. Meaning the idea of burning the Torah and of separating the Jews from the Torah is that it's the Torah of the Jews that bothers them. It's not just it's not a bloodline. It's not a bloodline. It's the Torah of the Jews. It's your Messiah. It's your Torah Shabbat Peh, which is what the Shas is. It's your Torah Shabbat Peh that says, hang on and stick with it even throughout Gullus, etc., like we've talked about many times. That's the part that the Catholicism is coming to attack, and that's the part that the Merami Rutenberg feels like rises to the level of Churban. Meaning when you see it in that context, it's all part of the Nevuah of Daniel. Daniel saying Klal Yisrael is going to face this Gullus of the Malchus Revi, which is much more fearful and much more detrimental, much more all-consuming than any of the ones before, because any of the ones before just came to destroy some Jewish bodies. But Catholicism, which is what Rome turned into, and its contest with Judaism for like the ultimate crown to what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants and what the Torah is, that's a much more destructive force. That's much more thing. Now, that's the reason why they saw it necessary and prudent, meaning it made sense to them to focus on burning the Shas. Now, what's interesting is because of this, I think, is why thematically throughout Jewish history, once it was discovered that burning the Shas was a good option to be rid of Jews, it came up again and again and again and again. There's 10 different times throughout Jewish history that Gemaras were burnt, that Svarim were burnt, meaning burning Svarim became like a primary go-to method to fight with Jews, because there was a Havana that fighting with Jews meant fighting with Judaism. That's what it was. And Judaism lives in the Shas. Judaism lives in the Talmud. Jews are kind of replaceable. Judaism is not replaceable. If you could uproot Judaism, uproot the idea, fight with it. That's why now there's so many of them that happen throughout the Dairis. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I want to focus only on one, because there's a Meifus from the Baal Shem Tov that says about that one. So let's talk about that one. It's actually, you'll see Rabbi Yaakov Emden kind of brings down the Baal Shem Tov's involvement. If you're Chassidish, you say Rabbi Yaakov Emden Mamish brings it down and everything's good to go. If you're not, then Rabbi Yaakov Emden doesn't really bring down a Meifus, but he does bring down the Baal Shem Tov was in proximity, or at least, relatively involved in this discussion. Now what I'm referring to is the Frankistan. What do you say? Can't you stuff this in at the end? Okay, we'll talk about it for a few minutes. We might have to discuss. We might have to circle back and do it more properly. But Jacob Frank was a Polish kid who was born in a Shapsai family, and as a young 13, 14-year-old boy, he went to be trained and had to sell diamond salesman. He moved to Turkey, where he came in close contact with the Dunme, which was at that time the most extreme sect of Shapsayim that remained on the market. They were the most extreme believers in Shapsai Tzvi. They had been from the families that moved with Shapsai Tzvi to Izmir when the Sultan took him in and forced Shapsai Tzvi to convert to Islam. The Dunma still stayed. They were they believed, no matter what, whatever. They stayed with it all the way through. You know what I'm saying? They stayed with it all the way through. The Dunma. Now, Jacob Frank was born 100 years after Shapsai Tzvi was born, which means he was born like 50 years after Shapsai Tzvi died. Now, at the time, Bruchya was the head of the Dunma in Turkey. Bruchya's claim to fame was that he was a Gilgul of Shapsai Tzvi. He had been born right after Shapsai Tzvi died, and that was his claim to fame, that he was a Gilgul. Jacob Frank went to Izmir. I believe he even married a daughter of Bruchya. I could be wrong about that, but no, I'm wrong. Okay, he and one of the big chavra, he married one of the royal families of the Dunma, and when Bruchya died, Jacob Frank proclaimed that the neshama of Shabtai Tzvi that had been nisgalgal into Bruchya was now nisgalgal into him, and he was the walking embodiment of Shabtai Tzvi. Now, what's interesting is that the Dunma who lived in Izmir were not taken by this Galiciani Geman who showed up and said he's Shabtai Tzvi. And they would be right of him. They threw stones at him, they called him a faker, and he ultimately had to leave Izmir because they didn't buy that this newcomer suddenly who showed up, this Polish guy, was now Shabtai Tzvi. But he went back to Poland, and in Poland they believed him, and it was very popular, and he was able to put together a pretty nice following. Whatever, it's relatively a small following in numbers, but a decent following of Shapsayim throughout Poland, and reinvigorate the Shapsai madness in Europe. Now, ultimately they had a coming out party of sorts, where him and his Hasidim made a very lewd and disgusting party. I won't go into the details, at least not in this episode. I won't go into details on that, but they made a coming out party of sorts, and it was clearly drunken madness. It wasn't something that was like planned or intended. It wasn't by the book. It just kind of happened. Whatever. And Yaakov Frank, understood what I get. People today, a lot of people in crisis understand, never apologize. And instead of saying that he was wrong and that this was out of hand, he said, "Yeah, we don't have to be embarrassed of what we believe. We don't have to hide what we believe. This is who we are. And if we're wrong, then don't go with us." Mila Shem Elai, shtickle of Jacob Frank. And ultimately, it was the beginning of his undoing, because most people in Poland, especially those who had been scarred by previous cycles of Shabtai Tzvi, were not able to be saved. The crazy antinomianism of it and the lewdness of it and the disgusting behavior that the Frankists were engaged in, and made a pivot from him. Now, the Frankists were running out of options because he had left Izmir, under a cloud of of disgrace. Now he came to Poland and was receiving much of the same treatment. So the Frankistim reached out to the church, to the bishop of Kamenetz-Podolya, and started a dispute about Yiddishkeit and the Talmud and etc. Now, the dispute itself is interesting, and the story is interesting, and ultimately, of course, as all these disputes go, the Jews were never able to win these disputes, and they lost the battle. They lost the battle, but they won the war. They lost the battle because in Kamenetz-Podolya, the bishop ruled that they need to burn all the Svarim, and actually the Svarim were supplied. Most of the Jews who lived in the area quickly hid their Svarim, so they shouldn't be touched, and the Frankists then provided the Svarim. The Frankists had to turn in all their books, all of their Gemaras and their Svarim that they had. They turned them in, and the bishop of Kamenetz-Podolya burnt them over there. Now, there was supposed to be a ripple effect, and the bishop was reaching out to other, like-minded individuals that all over Poland they should do this idea of burning the Talmud, burning the Shas. And actually, the person who was recruited to lead the battle against this is Yaakov Emden. Yaakov Emden was living in Altona in Germany. He was not in Poland at the time, but he was recruited to lead the battle, and he's why we have so much evidence about it, because Kedarka B'Kodesh, he recorded all of it in a whole sefer about the Indian. He recorded the whole story. Now, he was a very proficient polemicist. He knew exactly how to deal with this, and he led a tremendous charge against the charges. Ultimately, his anti-closed-mindedness, call it, meaning his this idea of burning the Talmud, was translated into German and published for the intelligent people in Europe at the time. It was already the late 1700s. There was already a move towards open-mindedness. It didn't really come yet, but there was a move towards it, and the intelligentsia in Europe was impressed with Yaakov Emden's presentation, and it really kind of stemmed the tide of where this was headed. Now, there is also something fascinating. Yaakov Emden records this, and it's undeniable. It's a fact that the bishop of Kamenetz-Podolya died a strange and sudden death shortly after burning of the Gemara. And not just him, and there's a lot of details that are brought down about the story. Now, I'll read you a little bit of the bishop's death, just it's interesting. One second, if I can find it. You like hearing about the deaths? It doesn't usually end like this. You don't usually get the happy ending. But the bishop of Kamenetz-Podolya, literally a few...
The day that he became the archbishop, and I think the day he became archbishop...
There's a different eschayos, either a few days, a few weeks, but yeah, he got sick in short order. Mamash, right after he got a new position, he got sick, the bishop, and he lay on his deathbed for a few days. And he kept in his ramblings, in his feverish ramblings, he said he keeps seeing these little worms. No, they're not worms. They're letters that are attacking me. They're letters from the books. And everyone around them would say, "We don't see any worms, Bishop. We don't see any letters." No, they're letters. They're letters. They won't let me. And in his fever, lunacy, he was ranting about the books and the words that are attacking him. And everybody understood this to be like a real, stopping point. Now, what's interesting is that the Frankisten, who had hitched their wagon with the bishop, came to be with him in his time of tzara, and they came with their trusty tehillims. They came with their trusty tehillims like Jews. And they were saying tehillim at the bishop's bedside that he should be saved from the letters that are attacking him. And the bishop, even in his feverish lunacy, realized how preposterous this was, and he had them beaten and evicted from his room. He understood this was preposterous, that the people who had fafired him into dealing with this were now saying Jewish hymns at his bedside to have him cured, and he had them driven out with great bizyonis, driven out from a church. Now, it didn't help him. And he died, and several other people died, and there's a lot of details. You're right. We're going to have to circle back to the prophet. There's a lot of details of the story. Now, in the Shivchei HaBesht, it's gebracht that the Baal Shem Tov, on the Yom Kippur before this, I think it's Yom Kippur, on Erev Yom Kippur, the Baal Shem Tov said that he sees a terrible tzara for Klal Yisrael, and there needs to be a little bit of a Sar Lazazel towards it, and then it's going to be resolved. And he davened and whatever. And at the end of Yom Kippur, they asked him if he resolved, and Baal Shem Tov told him that there's a little bit of a concession to the gzeira that has to exist, but the gzeira is not going to get out of hand. And then later in the year, the debate, the burning, etc., and was Niskayim like the Baal Shem Tov's words. Now, there's a lot of different versions of the story that are brought down in different places. Exact versions. What's interesting is that Rabbi Yaakov Emden, in his sefer where he records all the stories of the Frankist debate, he does record that there was a person, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, who was involved in helping out. Now, it doesn't seem Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov was actually on the team of the people who had the debate, but he was very close to some of the people who did debate on the team, and he was in proximity, involved, and aware of everything that was happening in this story. So this is it was considered like a meifus of the Baal Shem Tov, that the bishop died this horrible death on the day. It's just another episode in Klal Yisrael's long history of the attack on the Torah. I don't think it ends. Like Halbach says, the story has no end. This goes on and on and on. It's been going on for 1,000 years, and it goes on and on. The attack on the Torah, the Baal Shem Tov's meifus is just one of the interesting stopping points along charting that is really, I say 8 to 10 different ones that we could go into that are all, each one of them worthy of a story on its own. Fascinating stories, fascinating details, etc. And maybe Oid Chazan L'Mayed will even circle back to the Baal Shem Tov again for another round of Jacob Frank. Okay.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.